Shadow had never known warmth, only pain and fear behind the rusty fences of a Tennessee backyard. When Maggie Evans, a teacher facing her own scars, discovered him trembling and alone, she decided she couldn't walk away. But saving Shadow meant facing her own demons, confronting a violent owner, and reaching out to Jeremy, a troubled teen who held the key to everything. Then came the stormy night that changed it all. Would Shadow finally trust enough to save a life? Watch to find out. And tell us below, what would you have done in Maggie's shoes? Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more powerful stories. The morning fog clung to the winding roads of Pine Hollow, a quiet town tucked between the folds of Tennessee's southern ridgelines. Mist threaded through rows of bare sycamores like restless spirits. It was late October, and the air had turned sharp with the kind of cold that whispered of coming frost. Leaves scraped gently across the pavement, their brittle forms caught in a dance of wind and wear. The town was still, too small for traffic, too tucked away for tourists, leaving behind only the hush of wind brushing against creaky fences and the distant caw of crows circling above the tree line. Maggie Evans stood in the narrow gravel driveway of the modest two-bedroom house she had just moved into, its white siding weather-stained and the porch rails warped by time. She was 38, tall with a willowy build, the kind that seemed permanently braced against some internal storm. Her auburn hair, streaked with the soft beginnings of gray, was tied in a low, practical bun. Her face bore quiet beauty, with green eyes dulled slightly by grief, and fine lines etched not from age, but from years spent frowning into silence. She dressed plainly, jeans, a worn flannel shirt, and a beige jacket a size too large. Everything about Maggie was measured and contained, except, perhaps, for the way she stared at the crumbling property next door. The house beside hers wasn't just neglected, it was forgotten. Shingles peeled like scabs from the roof. A rusted truck without wheels sat like a tombstone in the overgrown yard. The fence, once meant to keep something in or out, now slumped in the middle like it had given up entirely. Maggie had noticed the house the day she moved in, but it wasn't until this morning, when she took her coffee out to the porch for the first time, that she heard the whimper. It wasn't loud. It wasn't even constant, but it was unmistakably broken. She stood at the edge of the property now, just past the old mailbox with faded red letters. Carson. Her heart thudded in a steady drumbeat. Something about that sound had rooted itself in her, the tone of desperation in it. She knew it too well. She'd worn that same kind of invisible bruise herself. A soft rustle caught her attention. There, behind a crooked section of chain-link fence and half-collapsed wood paneling, a pair of amber eyes glinted from the shadows beneath the porch. Maggie squinted, stepping carefully through a gap in the fence, brushing past weeds and tall, dead grass. The smell hit her next, damp filth, rot, and fear. But she kept going. He was barely visible at first, just a shifting shape huddled against the brick foundation. Then the shape moved. A German shepherd, no more than 4 or 5 years old, but malnourished and covered in clumps of matted fur. His coat, once likely sable and rich, was now dulled with dirt and thinned in patches. Ribs jutted beneath the fur, and his ears were pinned so tightly to his skull that he seemed to shrink into the ground. He didn't bark. He didn't growl. He just watched her, his eyes wide and unblinking, body quivering like a leaf held in a trembling hand. Maggie crouched slowly, careful not to move too fast. "Hey there," she whispered, her voice softer than she thought it could still be. "It's okay." The dog flinched. His whole body contracted as if he expected the world to hit him. Maggie's breath caught. "What happened to you?" she murmured, more to herself than to him. She didn't get closer. She didn't reach out. Instead, she just sat down on the damp grass, a few feet away, careful to keep her posture relaxed. She watched him, and he watched her, and the distance between them remained like a wound that neither of them quite knew how to cross. Later that morning, Maggie visited the town's small grocery and post office in one, a squat brick building near the only gas station for miles. Behind the counter stood Sarah Dalton, a lean woman in her late 50s with steel gray hair, clipped short, and fierce brown eyes that missed nothing. She wore a threadbare cardigan over a flannel shirt and moved with the stiffness of someone who had once been a dancer, or perhaps a soldier. "You're the new one in Evans' place," Sarah said, not unkindly, as she rang up a can of dog food Maggie had picked up. Maggie nodded. "Yeah, moved in Tuesday. You got a dog?" "Not officially," Maggie replied, then paused. "You know the old house next door? The one with the truck in the yard?" Sarah's face hardened slightly. "Carson Place. You don't want to mess with that." "Why?" "Bill Carson's a mean drunk. Lives out in the woods, mostly now. Left that poor animal behind about 2 winters ago when the county came knocking on his door. Nobody reported it." "Who to?" Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Sheriff's office barely got gas in their tank. And no one wants to end up on Bill's bad side. That dog, he don't bark. Don't move. Just hides and survives. Most gave up on him. He ain't right." Maggie's jaw tightened. "He's not broken. Just scared." Sarah studied her for a moment, then slid the can back across the counter. "Take this one on the house. But be careful. That house, it eats people who care too much." Back at home, the sky had turned slate gray. The wind was picking up, rattling the dry branches of the trees. Maggie stepped outside, food in hand. She made her way back to the fence, now familiar with every sag and snag along the path. The shepherd was still there, in the same place, as if he hadn't moved in hours. She didn't speak this time. She simply sat down again, opened the can, and placed it gently on the ground between them. He didn't move, but he smelled it. His nostrils flared. His ears twitched. And though his body remained curled in that tight, miserable coil, his eyes stayed on her. She didn't expect a miracle. She just needed a beginning. As the wind picked up and the sky threatened rain, Maggie sat there, still quiet, patient. In her heart, she didn't just see a wounded dog. She saw a reflection of herself, of the pieces she was still trying to gather. This dog hadn't known a gentle hand. Neither had she, until she offered her own. The days in Pine Hollow unfolded in a slow, methodical rhythm. By the second week of November, the leaves had lost their color entirely, leaving brittle skeletons clinging to branches like quiet regrets. A thin crust of morning frost covered everything: rooftops, car windshields, and the patchy grass where Maggie Evans now spent most of her early hours. She had added a wool blanket to her morning routine, draping it around her shoulders as she sat on the cold ground outside the Carson property. Her thermos, steaming with weak coffee, rested by her knee, but she rarely drank it. Most of her attention remained fixed on the dark shape beneath the porch. Shadow. He still hadn't moved much. Most mornings, Maggie would set out fresh water and a small bowl of food, something warm if she had time, and wait. No touching, no reaching, no pressure. She spoke only when necessary, using a voice so soft it could almost be mistaken for the wind through the fence slats. At first, Shadow would barely glance in her direction, but slowly something shifted. On the 4th day, he licked the water. On the 6th, he ate while she was still within view. By the 9th, his eyes followed her even after the food was gone. That morning, as Maggie approached the fence with a small tin of warm chicken and rice, she noticed his ears twitch before she made a sound. A week ago, he would have disappeared into darkness at her footsteps. Today, he simply shifted his weight, watching. "You remember me?" she said gently, crouching. "That's good." He didn't move forward, but he didn't recoil either. That was more than she could have hoped for. Her days didn't end there. After her early morning sessions with Shadow, Maggie would change into clean clothes, tie her hair into a loose braid, and head into Pine Hollow High School, a red brick building with paint-chipped doors and a surprisingly well-maintained garden out front. She had taken the mid-year position teaching literature after the previous teacher left on short notice, citing burnout, though the whispers hinted at something more. Her classroom was tucked near the back of the school, near the boiler room that always hissed like a distant snake. That morning, the chairs were half filled with students still wearing earbuds and hoodies pulled low over their eyes. She recognized most names by now, but one stood out: Jeremy Hayes. He sat in the far corner, hoodie up despite the school's rules, tapping a pencil against his desk in a steady rhythm that grated on the nerves. He was 16, tall for his age, with lean limbs and a permanent scowl carved into his face. His hair was dark and unkempt, and his skin pale from too much time spent indoors. There was something guarded in his posture, as if even sitting upright would expose too much. He didn't speak unless called on. When Maggie asked him a question about mice and men, he responded with a shrug and a flat, "I don't know," eyes avoiding hers like it was dangerous to be seen. After class, she caught him in the hallway. "Jeremy, got a minute?" He turned slowly, not stopping. "Didn't do anything." "I know," she said, falling in a step beside him. "I just wanted to ask how you're doing." "Settling in?" He gave her a sidelong glance. "I've lived here my whole life." "Fair enough. Then I'm the one settling in, still figuring everyone out." He stopped at his locker, but didn't open it. "People usually stop asking." "Maybe they shouldn't," Maggie replied, her tone even. "Sometimes people need someone to ask." That earned her a flicker of something, annoyance or curiosity, she couldn't tell. But he didn't walk away. Maggie had heard fragments about Jeremy from the other teachers. His mother had died when he was 7. His father, Tom Hayes, worked as a mechanic on the edge of town, a man known for his silence and short temper. The boy had once been bright, even cheerful, but years of tension at home had drained him. Now he floated through school like a ghost with sharp edges. Later that afternoon, after grading a stack of dismal essays, Maggie found herself back outside the Carson house. The air was colder now, and Shadow remained in his usual place under the porch. But this time, when she placed the food bowl down and took a seat, something happened. Shadow stretched. It was a small thing, a slow extension of his front paws, a slight shift in his hips, the kind of movement most dogs do without thinking. But for Shadow, it was monumental. Maggie held her breath. His muscles tensed, and for a moment, she thought he might retreat again. But instead, he took one step, then another, into the open. He didn't approach her, not directly. He stopped 3 feet away from the food bowl, sniffed the air cautiously, then edged closer and began to eat. His body remained low, tail tucked tight against his belly, but he didn't bolt. Maggie sat frozen, her hands clenched in her lap. "Good boy," she whispered. As if startled by her voice, Shadow's head jerked slightly, but he continued eating. She smiled, her breath fogging in the cold air. "We're getting there." From across the yard, a sudden creak broke the moment. A window from the Carson house rattled open slightly, then slammed shut. Maggie looked up, but saw no one. She stood slowly, scanning the trees beyond the lot. There was movement there, she thought, a dark shape shifting between trunks, but it disappeared too fast. She glanced back at Shadow. He had frozen, food forgotten, body trembling. Slowly, he backed away, retreating under the porch again. "It's okay," Maggie said gently, her voice low. "I'm still here." That night, she sat on her porch with a blanket and a pen in hand. Her journal, half filled with entries about Pine Hollow, Shadow, and her own tangled thoughts, lay open on her lap. In the quiet, she wrote, "I think trust is built in the spaces between fear. That space is small, but maybe it's enough." The porch light flickered above her. From beneath the Carson house, a pair of amber eyes watched through the darkness. And this time, Shadow didn't flinch. By the 3rd week of November, winter began to press its weight on Pine Hollow with greater certainty. The sky hovered low, smudged with gray, and the wind carried a sharpness that burned the skin. Trees stood bare and still like skeletal sentinels, and the mornings came not with sunlight, but with silence. Maggie Evans rose early as always, wrapped in an oversized navy coat and fleece-lined boots. She carried a thermos in one hand and a folded blanket in the other. There was frost on the ground and ice clinging to the porch rails of the Carson property. But she went anyway. Shadow had made more progress in the past 5 days than in the first 2 weeks combined. He now approached the food bowl while she remained seated nearby. And though he still flinched at sudden sounds, there was something in his body language, a hesitation softened, a gaze less guarded, that told Maggie her presence was no longer seen as a threat. That morning, as she placed the bowl down and stepped back to her usual spot near the fence, Shadow emerged from under the porch with less fear. He sniffed the air, padded forward slowly, tail low but not tucked. Maggie said nothing, only watched him with quiet reverence. She had started keeping a record of their interactions in a notebook, something private, a kind of personal log of healing, not just for Shadow, but for herself. Every step he took was a reminder that patience could mend what cruelty had shattered. But this morning would not follow the same rhythm. As Shadow leaned down to sniff the bowl, the sudden slam of a truck door shattered the stillness. Maggie stood quickly, heart catching. From the gravel drive at the edge of the property, a man staggered into view. He was tall, maybe late 50s, with a frame that once held strength but now sagged under the weight of years and drink. His face was ruddy and sun-worn, beard uneven and speckled with gray. A cigarette dangled from the corner of his mouth, and a half-empty bottle of something amber sloshed in his left hand. Bill Carson. The man's eyes narrowed the moment he saw her. "What the hell are you doing on my land?" His voice was a rough bark, hoarse from alcohol and old rage. Maggie held her ground. "I wasn't on your land. I've been feeding the dog." "That mutt ain't yours," he snapped, stumbling closer. "Don't need no do-gooder teacher stick in her nose where it don't belong." Shadow had already bolted under the porch, his bowl knocked over, contents spilling into the frozen grass. Maggie clenched her hands inside her coat pockets to keep them from shaking. "He's starving. He needs help." Bill stopped, his breath rising in visible puffs. "You think you know what's best for him? That dog's mean. Unfixable." "No," Maggie said, voice calm but firm. "He's scared. There's a difference." The man laughed, harsh, joyless. "Lady, you don't know what that dog's been through. You try talking him, I'll have the sheriff on your doorstep." She watched him retreat into the house, slamming the door so hard the front window rattled. Maggie stood in place for another long minute, her breath shaky now, fear creeping into her stomach like cold seeping through the seams of her coat. "Back home," she called the local animal control line. It rang twice and then clicked to voicemail. The next morning at school, her thoughts were fractured, scattered between essays, lesson plans, and the image of Shadow's tail vanishing under the porch in terror. In her third period class, Jeremy Hayes didn't look up from his notebook. He was sketching again, something rough and jagged in pencil. After the bell rang, Maggie approached him. "You draw a lot." Jeremy shrugged. "Better than talking. Where are you drawing?" He hesitated, then turned the notebook. It was a dog, sharp-angled and hunched, with deep shadows around the eyes. Maggie recognized it instantly. "Is that Shadow?" Jeremy blinked. "You know that dog? I've been feeding him, trying to help." Jeremy closed the notebook. "You won't get far." "Why do you say that?" He lifted his eyes, green and haunted. "'Cause people like that don't let go. They keep you trapped, even when you think you're free." There was silence between them, taut and honest. "You're not just talking about the dog, are you?" Maggie asked softly. Jeremy looked away. "My dad doesn't hit, but he might as well." Maggie didn't push. Instead, she sat across from him at the empty desk. "You know, Shadow only started trusting me after 2 weeks. At first, I thought he'd never come out, never look at me. But he did, because I kept showing up." Jeremy's eyes met hers again, a flash of anger, and beneath it, something more fragile. "And if you don't, then he hides again, maybe forever. But I'm not going anywhere." He didn't say anything more, but he didn't leave either. Later that evening, Maggie sat on her porch in the dark, flipping through her notes. Her phone buzzed, an unknown number. She answered. "This Miss Evans?" came a gruff voice. "Yes, this is Officer Clem Jackson from Hollow County Animal Control. Got your voicemail. That dog's been reported before. Carson's a known case, but no charges ever stuck. If you can catch the dog and prove neglect, we might have a case." Maggie's heart raced. "He's skittish. I can't even touch him yet." "Well, that's the problem, ma'am. If you can't secure him safely, legally we got no grounds. Not unless we see direct abuse. Can I take him in if he comes willingly?" Jackson grunted. "Long as he crosses that fence on his own, it ain't trespassing. But I'll warn you, Carson's not the forgiving type." "I'm not afraid of him," Maggie lied. As the call ended, she stepped onto the porch, scanning the dark. Across the yard, she saw the faintest flicker of light from under the porch, Shadow's eyes. She whispered, "Just come a little closer." The wind howled down from the mountains that bordered Pine Hollow like silent watchmen, pushing through the narrow alleys and chimneys of the sleeping town. It was nearly midnight. The street lamps cast pale cones of light onto the empty sidewalks, their glow fractured by branches that clawed at the air. Maggie Evans stood wrapped in a long wool coat at the edge of the Carson property, her breath fogging in front of her face, her heart thudding with something between resolve and fear. The decision had been made hours earlier, though it felt like it had been simmering for weeks. Shadow couldn't wait anymore. With each passing day, Bill Carson grew bolder in his warnings. She had seen him outside 2 days ago, pacing in his yard with a beer in one hand and something metallic swinging from the other. She couldn't tell if it was a tool or a threat, but the message was clear: stay away. Shadow had started inching closer to the fence line in recent evenings. Twice now, he had stepped just far enough for his front paws to touch the gravel on Maggie's side. It wasn't a full crossing, but it was a plea. She moved slowly through the tall grass, flashlight angled low so the beam wouldn't catch the windows. A warm tin of leftover stew sat in her gloved hands, its scent carried on the wind. Shadow was waiting. He emerged from beneath the porch like a ghost coaxed from another realm. His coat darker than night, his ribs still visible, but now layered with a soft sheen from healthier meals. His ears twitched at her approach, but he didn't retreat. "Hey, boy," she whispered, crouching and placing the food just past the fence, a little closer than usual. "You hungry?" He didn't answer. He never did, but his body moved toward her, cautious but without panic. He sniffed the air, took a tentative step. Then a voice shattered the silence. "You don't listen, do you?" Maggie stood abruptly, the flashlight jerking toward the house. Bill Carson stepped out from the shadows of his porch. He wore a heavy flannel coat with grease stains and cigarette burns along the sleeves. His boots crunched on frost-hardened grass, and in his right hand, unmistakable now, was a rusted crowbar. "I told you to stay off my land," he slurred, staggering forward, his eyes bloodshot, teeth clenched. "That much's mine." Maggie stood her ground, heart racing, breath catching. "He doesn't want to be yours. He's starving. He's terrified." "Terrified of what?" Bill barked, stepping closer. "Of me? I gave him food. I gave him shelter. You locked him in a crawl space and let him rot. I ought to lock you somewhere," he snapped, lifting the crowbar slightly. Behind him, a figure moved. From the edge of the lot, just beyond the old rusted truck, a flashlight flickered weakly. Then came a voice, unsteady but loud. "Leave her alone." Bill turned. "Who the hell?" Jeremy Hayes stepped out of the shadows, his fists clenched at his sides, the hood of his sweatshirt down for once, his face pale but defiant. He looked taller in the dark, older somehow, like the fear had burned away just enough to leave something solid behind. "You touch her, and I'll call Sheriff Denton. I'll tell him everything," Jeremy said. Bill blinked. The boy's voice wasn't deep, but it didn't waver. "You're just a kid," Bill muttered. Jeremy took a step closer. "Doesn't mean I can't tell the truth." Something in that moment shifted. Perhaps it was the trembling in Bill's fingers, the way the cold stole his certainty, or maybe the recognition that for the first time, he was outnumbered. He spat to the side and lowered the crowbar. "This town's full of idiots," he growled, and turned back toward the house. "You want that broken mutt? Take him. He ain't worth the fight anyway." The door slammed behind him, loud enough to send Shadow crawling backward. Maggie turned to Jeremy, stunned. What are you doing here?" Jeremy's shoulders dropped, his breath fogging as he finally allowed himself to exhale. "I couldn't sleep. Thought maybe you'd come." "How did you?" "I saw your porch light, then saw you heading this way. Figured you'd need someone." Her eyes filled, not from fear, but from the clarity of what this night had revealed. Shadow wasn't the only soul who needed saving. The silence returned as Shadow crept forward again. Maggie turned back, knelt beside the food tin. "It's okay," she said gently. "He's gone." And Shadow, after another long moment of stillness, moved forward, one paw, then another, until the tips of his paws crossed the gravel boundary. He didn't bolt this time. He didn't flinch. He ate, slowly and carefully, with his body fully on Maggie's side of the fence. She didn't reach out. She didn't try to touch him. She just sat, letting the moment wash over them all. Jeremy stood nearby, watching. "That dog," he said softly. "He was never the problem." "No," Maggie replied, her voice cracking. "He was just waiting for someone not to give up." They stayed until the frost began to silver the world again, until the town was still and the house behind them was silent. Then Maggie stood, brushing off her coat. "Come on," she whispered to Shadow. "Let's go home." Shadow hesitated, then followed. The first snow of the season arrived quietly, drifting through the early morning hours like a whispered apology. By the time the sun tried to pierce through the overcast sky, Pine Hollow had transformed into a town of white silence. Roofs were dusted, lawns blanketed, and the world felt paused. But inside Maggie Evans' modest home, silence meant something different. Shadow had spent the first night curled in the corner of the kitchen, wedged between the refrigerator and the old wooden cabinets. She had laid out a thick blanket and placed a bowl of water and food nearby, but the dog had touched neither. His body remained tight, head low, eyes flicking toward every creak and shift in the house like they were ghosts from his past. Maggie watched him from the threshold, arms wrapped around herself. Her breath caught every time he flinched at movement, every time his tail tugged at the sound of her footsteps. She had imagined this moment, the day Shadow would be free from Bill Carson's yard. But reality was heavier than fantasy. Freedom wasn't instant healing. It was a doorway, not a destination. Later that day, she brought Shadow's food closer and sat on the kitchen floor, her back against the cabinets, a paperback book in hand. She didn't speak. She didn't look at him. She just read softly, letting the rhythm of her voice fill the space. After an hour, he shifted his position slightly. That was enough for her to keep going. At school, the halls buzzed with post-snow day energy. Students stomped wet boots, laughed louder, and chattered about sledding in near-missed buses. But Maggie's eyes scanned each classroom for a boy who wasn't there. Jeremy Hayes hadn't shown up. By third period, her worry had calcified into certainty. She approached the front office where Mrs. Lorna Webb, the school's secretary, sat behind a chipped desk piled with files and half a knit scarf. Lorna was in her late 60s, short and round-shouldered, with dyed blonde curls that framed a kind face always partially obscured by reading glasses. "Heard from Jeremy today?" Maggie asked gently. Lorna pushed her glasses up, frowning. "Not a word. His dad called in yesterday. Said Jeremy was under the weather." She made air quotes with a skeptical look. "But I don't buy it. That boy shows up even when he doesn't want to. Has he ever gone missing?" Lorna hesitated. "Not officially, but there've been calls. Police were involved once, about 2 years ago. Stayed out in the woods overnight. Father didn't notice till a neighbor saw the back door open." Maggie nodded slowly, her pulse quickening. That evening, Shadow remained motionless in the corner as the wind scraped against the windows. Maggie tried coaxing him with chicken broth and slow movements, but he didn't eat. He didn't make a sound. His eyes were wide and distant, his chest rising and falling faster than normal. Panic, silent and suffocating. Maggie picked up her phone, scrolling through contacts until she reached Calvin Grant, a veterinarian in his late 40s who ran a small clinic in town. Calvin was tall and wiry, with kind brown eyes and sleeves always rolled up to the elbow. A single father of 3 grown daughters, he had a calm presence that made both humans and animals feel steadier in their bones. "Sounds like trauma shut down," he said over the phone after she explained Shadow's state. "He's safe now, but his body doesn't know it yet. Keep doing what you're doing, low pressure, consistency, warmth. If he doesn't eat in another day, I'll come by." Maggie thanked him and set the phone down, then walked back to the kitchen and simply sat again, whispering the lines of a poem she hadn't read in years. Not for Shadow, for both of them. Just as she began to feel the cold through the floor, there was a knock on the door, sharp, urgent. She opened it to find Officer Dana Riley, a woman in her early 30s with short black hair under a sheriff's hat and a tight, no-nonsense expression. Her dark green parka was still flecked with snow. "Evening, Miss Evans," she said quickly. You've had contact with Jeremy Hayes, correct? Maggie's stomach dropped. Yes. What? His father reported him missing an hour ago. Last seen yesterday. He took a backpack and some supplies. Maybe on foot. Maggie's mind spun. He knows the woods. Could he be trying to get to the trail behind the quarry? He mentioned it once. Officer Riley nodded. Possible. Cold's going to drop below 20 tonight. If you remember anything else, text messages, journals, notes, call it in. We'll keep you posted. When the door closed, Maggie leaned against it, breath shallow. Shadow whined quietly from the kitchen, his first sound in hours. I know, she whispered. Someone else is lost too. Without thinking, she grabbed her coat, flashlight, and hiking boots. Before stepping out, she turned back. Stay, she said to Shadow, then paused. Or come. He didn't move. Maggie drove toward the old fire road leading to the woods behind the quarry. One of the few places teenagers went when they wanted to disappear. She parked her car near the old ranger station and began walking, her boots crunching over icy leaves. Jeremy, she called into the dark. No answer, just wind. Then, barely audible, a bark. She froze. Another bark, closer. She turned, heart racing. From the shadows came a familiar shape, Shadow, bounding awkwardly through the brush, still unsure of his footing on snow, but determined. And behind him, under a low fir tree, Jeremy, huddled in his hoodie, shivering but conscious. Maggie dropped beside him. Jeremy. Hey, I've got you. He blinked up at her. I didn't know where else to go. I know, she whispered, wrapping her coat around him. But I'm here now. Shadow pressed close to them, his body still trembling, but his eyes calm. He hadn't just followed. He had led her here. They sat there together in the cold until headlights from the sheriff's truck broke through the trees. When the officers arrived, Jeremy didn't let go of Maggie's hand, and Shadow didn't flinch at the voices. They were no longer just survivors. There was something more. The wind began to rise just before dawn, bending the trees along the edge of Pine Hollow like weary giants bowing to an unseen force. The sky churned in deep bruised grays, and the weather alert had already gone out to the town. A late-season storm was moving in fast, stronger than expected, carrying sleet, flooding rain, and gusts that could down power lines. But even as the town braced for the worst, Maggie Evans was already slipping on her boots by candlelight. The power had flickered twice and then gone out. Her kitchen was dim, illuminated only by the soft amber of a camping lantern. Shadow lay near the back door, not cowering anymore, but watchful. His ears tilted at every groan of the wind, but his eyes were steady, alert, aware, almost ready. Maggie poured water into a thermos, checked her flashlight, then zipped her coat. The storm was building fast, and something in her chest hadn't settled since the early hours when Jeremy's father had called, shaky and barely coherent. Jeremy didn't come back last night, Tom Hayes had said. His voice wasn't angry this time, just scared. He's not answering. I thought maybe he came to you again. Maggie hadn't seen Jeremy since the rescue in the woods 2 days ago. The boy had seemed quieter, withdrawn again, but not fearful. They had shared soup on the couch while Shadow curled up at their feet. They had laughed softly about nothing. She had thought he was beginning to trust again. Now, in the gale-color morning, he was missing. She opened the back door, and Shadow rose with her, already on his feet, his body alert but calm. Maggie knelt down, placed a hand gently along his side. You feel it too, don't you? A low whine vibrated in Shadow's throat, not fear, but urgency. They set out into the wind, which was already rattling the shutters of homes along the main road. Most of Pine Hollow was still asleep, windows boarded or lights flickering through generators. Maggie passed Miss Delaney's diner, now shuttered with a closed due-to-weather sign on its fog window. Inside, Miss Delaney, a tall, wiry woman in her 60s with a stubborn chin and sleeves always rolled up, sat sipping coffee by a lantern, nodding solemnly as Maggie and the dog passed. She reached the trailhead near the ravine just as the first cold droplets of rain began to fall. This path wound behind the town, following the old creek that had once powered the sawmill decades ago. Jeremy had mentioned this trail once, said it was his escape route. Nobody follows it anymore, he'd said. not even the squirrels. Branches cracked overhead, and rain began in earnest. Maggie's boots slipped on wet roots as she called his name through the rising wind. Jeremy! There was no answer. Only Shadow's head whipping toward the west trail, ears pricked, tail raised. Then he barked. Not a fearful bark. Not startled. This was a declaration. Maggie ran after him, heart pounding. The trail twisted through thick trees, the earth already muddy, water rushing in rivulets along its edges. Shadow darted ahead, pausing only to look back and ensure she followed. They broke through a dense patch of underbrush, and suddenly the ground dipped sharply, revealing a small, fast-swelling creek. Maggie's breath hitched. The old wooden footbridge had washed out. On the other side, crouched against a tree with his arms wrapped tightly around himself, was Jeremy. He was soaked, shivering, and pale. "Jeremy!" Maggie shouted over the roar of the water. "Don't move. I tried to cross earlier," he called back, his voice hoarse. It was lower then it rose. Shadow paced beside the bank, whining, then stepped into the water instinctively, but Maggie held him back. "No," she whispered. "Not like that." She scanned the bank. 20 feet upstream, a fallen tree had formed a narrow natural bridge, slick but passable. Maggie pointed. "Come on, boy." They ran to it. Maggie crawled across carefully, balancing on knees and hands, the icy water below rushing in a blur. Shadow followed without hesitation, claws gripping bark, tail low but steady. Once across, Maggie knelt beside Jeremy. His lips were blue. "You shouldn't have come alone." Jeremy looked up, his eyes glassy. "I thought I could handle it, but I didn't want to go home." "You don't have to go back the same way," she said, wrapping her coat around him. "But you can't disappear either." Shadow nudged closer, pressing his head gently into Jeremy's shoulder. The boy blinked. "He found me." He never stopped looking. They took the return trail slower, Jeremy leaning on her shoulder, Shadow leading and then circling back like a guide. By the time they emerged into town, Sheriff Denon's truck, boxy and brown with a crooked antenna, was already parked outside the clinic, along with Tom Hayes' rusty sedan. Tom stood in the snow, pacing, soaked to the knees, his hands trembling. He was a big man, worn by time, with graying temples and eyes that rarely softened. But as Jeremy stepped into view, the man broke. He rushed forward. "I'm sorry," he rasped. "I didn't know how to fix it. I still don't." Jeremy didn't speak. He simply nodded, then stepped into the man's arms, brief and unsure, but enough. Later, as the storm passed and the first pale sun split the clouds, Maggie stood in front of her house. Shadow sat beside her, his tail gently thumping. "You saved him," she said, brushing snow off his ears. "You didn't run. You didn't freeze. You found him." Shadow leaned in her leg, eyes warm. Behind her, Jeremy stepped onto the porch. "He's going to stay, right?" Maggie looked at the boy. "Only if he wants to." Shadow wagged once, then nudged the door open with his nose. Maggie laughed, the sound real and bright. "I guess that's a yes." Inside that house, where once there had been only silence, there was now warmth and motion and trust. The kind that takes root slowly. The kind that saves lives. Sometimes, the ones who are the most afraid are the ones who need love the most. Shadow didn't heal overnight, and neither did Maggie or Jeremy. But through quiet patience, second chances, and the courage to simply stay, hearts that were once broken found their way back to each other. In our own lives, we often pass by those who are hiding behind invisible fences. People, animals, even parts of ourselves. This story reminds us that healing takes time, but love, when given freely and without demand, can change everything. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who might need a little hope today. Leave a comment below. Tell us what part moved you most. And if you believe in the power of second chances, type Amen in the comments to send a blessing to someone who might be hurting. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay with us for more true stories of love, rescue, and redemption. May God bless you and keep your heart open.